Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending this week's webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist, and this week we're going to be talking about printing and reporting, which appears to be a very popular topic. And what I have here is a bunch of examples we're going to go through. I want to remind people to feel free to ask questions. You can type them into the little question window on your GoToWebinar control panel. I'll see them on my other screen. I'll address them if I can and when it seems appropriate. So without further ado, let's take a look at some examples here. So we'll start with looking at some specific printing things, and we'll move on to reporting, and then we'll briefly talk about displaying something, report or something using a web app. So this here is a simple example that demonstrates how you would print both graphics and text. Now, the thing with Xojo is printing is essentially done on a graphics object. So you just draw on a graphics object, and that's what gets sent to the printer and printed. So if I run this here, you can see how that looks. So this actually will print two things. I'm obviously going to be doing these in print previews in PDF in the preview app since I can't actually print things and then hold them up for you all to look at. So I'm just going to constantly be picking open PDF in preview, and then we'll actually look at some examples that we can do previews right on the screen within your app as well. So here I'm just going to pick open PDF in preview, and you can see what this particular app does here. This is showing 2 pages, and it has some text in here showing you how you can access the various parts of the thing, corners and layouts, positions, so you can make print something that looks however you want it to look. And you can see 2 full pages there. And you can see this particular one has a relatively low resolution, just 72 by 72, and that's because we didn't display a printer dialog and asked for the resolution from the printer, which we can do. And it's what this second one does. You can see there's an extra dialog here that just came up, and now I can pick a specific printer that I have installed in the system. And then I can also display it as PDF. And you can see here the resolution is much higher. This particular inkjet can do 1200 by 1200. So it looks a little sharper in the preview as well. So let's see what that looks like. So code on the first button for the various setup stuff is pretty straightforward. You have to create a graphics object because that's where all the drawing is going to be done. And in this particular case, it's doing getting a printer setup string, opening the printer dialog, and making sure that the results are being returned from these particular things. And then it's calling the print example method, passing in the graphics object that was created from the printer dialog. And that's what, whatever you draw there is what gets sent to the printer. And the printer setup string allows you to grab specific printer type settings. Now, the print example is where most of the code is for this particular example that draws everything on the graphics object so that it gets sent to the printer. So this particular thing is just creating 2 pages. So it's just doing a for loop here with 2 pages. And then it's just drawing a bunch of lines and text and whatnot. And it's applying scaling factors based on the vertical resolution. And you can see strings are drawn using the drawstring. And these are the same commands that you would use when you're drawing in a canvas in the paint event handler. All the same stuff. And then at the very end, when you want to get to the next page, you call the next page property, or it's probably a method actually. And that essentially resets the graphics object so you can draw what will appear on the next page. The second button is pretty much the same thing. It also displays a page setup dialog, which allows you to select the printer and then request the actual maximum resolution from the printer so that it got back the higher 1200 by 1200 resolution that this printer supports. But other than that, it's the same code. All right, so that's a kind of a jump right in and see how you can start throwing stuff up on the printer. Let's take a look at a few more. Now this particular example here can show you how you can actually preview what you're going to print on the screen, which is pretty handy for most apps. So you can see here that there's a radio button we can choose. So if I leave it on screen and hit draw, it's just drawing it into a canvas, just like you would normally do in any app. But if we choose printer, the same drawing commands, again, because we're drawing to a canvas, can be sent to the printer's graphics object. So you get the same sort of thing. Now the drawing commands on this are a bit simpler. There is a method here that is just drawing, a very small picture, throwing some text and a rectangle in it. But you can see again, it's the same code that does the drawing. In this particular case, it's drawing it into a picture and returning the picture. And the picture is what gets drawn either to the canvas on the window, so it's displayed on the screen, or it gets used to send to the graphics object on the printer. All right, let's move along to this next example that also shows how you might throw some graphics up there. And this one is going to draw an actual picture, some sort of image, fun little image. Of the space shuttle. So you see, this is the low resolution version. It might be hard to tell in the webinar. It's a little fuzzy. And the high resolution version is a bit sharper. Again, might be hard to tell on the compression used by the webinar software. But there are situations when that makes sense to have different types of picture sizes to display depending on the resolution. So you can see, get these both open here, that essentially this is just drawing the picture and then scaling it as appropriate. And that's pretty much all you do. And again, this can be something I'll repeat over and over, but it's the same as if you're drawing to a canvas on a window. You're just drawing to the graphics object. So everything you may be used to working with there works the same way here. I got a comment here that says the screen might be appearing frozen from Michael. Is anyone else having a frozen screen right now? All right, lots of no's. So it looks like this is isolated to Michael. Unfortunately, maybe you'll need to restart the control panel and reconnect to the webinar. All right, let's see here what we have next. All right, this one shows you how you can send some text to the printer. And this is text that happens to be inside of a text area, and it's using the style text printer mechanism of that. So if we run this, we'll do the 2-column one. And you can see this particular text was sent to the printer, and it's been broken out into two columns and multiple pages. And then the regular button, I believe, just throws this out to a single column. Multiple pages as necessary. And you can see here that this is using the style text printer method on the text area. And since we didn't pop up all the dialogues to select a printer or whatnot, it's just defaulting to the 72 dots per inch resolution. So it's calculating that using the page width, so saying 72 times about 7.5 inches to calculate the size that is available for drawing this text on the graphics object for you. And then you just you loop through it, loop through the style text printer object that you get back, and you draw a chunk, get the next page, draw it until there's no more, and then you're done. Now, if you had your text area all set up with, actual styles in there, you had bolded text and, different font sizes and whatnot, that would all just automatically get set up here for you and then print to the printer. Multi-column, a little bit trickier. It actually has to do some math here to figure out which column it's going to be printing and draw the block appropriately. But still not too bad. A little bit more calculations that are needed for that math. But as you can see, it added, I suppose maybe it doubled the amount of code. But still overall pretty easy since you can do all the formatting and whatnot within the text area itself. So that's direct printing right from within Xojo. Now, as you can obviously tell here, Xojo pretty much provides the bare minimum of what you're going to need to be able to do your printer output. There's not, a whole heck of a lot of automated stuff for you. You got to draw everything that you want, unless you're coming from a text area using the style text printer, which does help simplify things. But if you're trying to mix text and graphics and everything, you're going to be doing a fair amount of code to draw all that directly to the graphics object. One thing that can be done to simplify some of that is to instead create a report. Which you can only do in desktop object projects. And we'll look at a few examples of this in a moment. But first, let's switch over here. All right. Just want to show you where that is. When you go to the Insert menu, there's an option here called Report. And that adds the report to your project, and you get the report layout editor. And this is a banded report designer, if you will. So the way it works is there's a center area called the body that essentially is repeated for each row of data that gets sent to the report. Then there are headers and footers that display at the beginning and ending of the pages. And generally, the information in there is typically static. The changing data is generally in the body. And you can also add groupings and whatnot. We'll look at some examples of that, so you can group your data differently depending on what it is. And there's a few different things you can actually add to the report. There's report fields, labels, pictures, various graphics type things for drawing, and a date, and the page number thing. And these just get dragged onto the report layout editor. And they have their own properties in the inspector, just like any other control that you would add to a window or a web page. Whoops. The properties are a little bit different, and there's a few here to call out. Probably the big one here is the data field. This is the name of the field and works in conjunction with a field that you add to the report that will be extracted from whatever the data source is that contains the data to display in the report. So this is typically a name. Uh, if your data is coming from a database, this probably would be the column name. If your data is coming from something that you set up using the dataset interface available with reporting, this would be the name that you set up in your code that contains the data to display in this field. And then there's formatting and multi-line stuff and some grouping functions you can apply to particular columns for display. And of course, you can have any number of reports in your project. Like I said, but they're only available in desktop projects. So let's open up an example here that uses a report to print the data that's in a list box. So this list box is filled with a bunch of dummy data. And if we do print it, you can see the Listbox data is now in a report. And we'll look at the report in a minute. Obviously, you can tell by looking at this is a pretty simple report, just has a couple fields in there with something in the header. So you can see the report right here. It's just the name report. And then nothing terribly sophisticated with how this is set up. A couple labels are in the page header, set to bold. And a couple fields are in the body. And they have their data fields set up with the name that is used, which we'll look at in a moment, by the data sets that's generated, or essentially the list box, so that the data can be mapped to the appropriate column in the report. And one thing I often do when I'm setting up these reports is you can see here, it actually says first name right in the display here, and that's because I put first name in for the text. Otherwise, it would just remain defaulted as untitled. And I kind of like this because it allows me to quickly see what my my fields map to. And it doesn't matter what's in here because that's going to get replaced at runtime when the report's running anyway. So it provides me with a nice clean way to look at the report and see where the data is coming from without having to click on each field and then look at the data field property. Let's see here. Ian asked a question if multiple reports can be nested to print more complex and structured reports. No, they cannot. The Xojo reporting does not support nesting of reports. So if you can't fit it all on a single screen, you won't be able to generate the report you want using the reporting thing. So then you'll have to either fall back on printing everything yourself directly to the graphics or using an alternative reporting tool. Let's see, Dennis is asking if the positioning of the elements is done in pixels, inches, or something special. That's a good question. I suspect these are probably done in the term of points, which probably varies depending on the layout of the report, but I don't particularly think it's inches, but to be honest, I don't know exactly. Yeah, it definitely isn't inches. That left is now 5, but the inch thing, 5 inches would be way over here. So much like with screen displays, it's got to be some sort of point system that is mapped to and converted to whatever the dots per inch that is being used by the printer. All right, so let's look at how this data gets from the list box to this report. So we're looking here at the list box. I'll click on the list box. You can see this is a we actually have a subclass of the list box called report data list box, and that is right down in here. And this implements, click on the interface here, it is implementing right here at the checkbox, the reports.dataset interface. And this is what allows you to use this particular list box as a data source for a report. By implementing that interface and adding it to anything, you could add it to your own classes or whatnot, but I added it to a list box subclass. It adds a bunch of methods to the list box for you. And you can see them right here. We got the end of file method, and this is used by the reporting engine to know when it has reached the end of the data. And you have to write the code in each of these events when you're coming from custom data sources, which is pretty much anything other than a database. And in this case, when you reach the end of a list box, to know if you reach the end of the data in the list box, it means that the row has exceeded the list count. So there's actually a property on here called mrow. And if it's greater than the list count, property is zero-based, list count is just a count, so we got to subtract 1. But then we know we're at the end, we can return true, otherwise we can return false. And that works in conjunction with the next record interface method, which is how you tell the reporting engine to get the next record in this data set. And in the case of a list box, we're just going to increase the row. We're going to start at the first one. We're going to keep just increasing the row until we hit, the list count number of rows. The run method is the one that is initially called by the reporting engine to essentially say, all right, start giving me the data. And we make sure it's always pointing to the first row of the list box. And then there's the field methods, which actually extract a piece of data from your data set. And there's two versions of this method that you have to implement. One takes an actual integer as the index, and the other takes the name of the field. So the name of the field being the actual text name that you would type in the data field property. So you can see we used first name and last name, so that's what is being looked up here. And it's returning the first column of the list box for the current row if you ask for the first name, and then the second column of the list box for the current row when you ask for the last name. And these are just mapped together so that 0 and 1 directly go to the first name and last name properties. But often the code between these two is very, very similar. And then the last thing you have to implement is the type of the value that's being fetched out of the data set. Now, in our particular example here, both of these columns are strings, so we're always returning string. We're not checking what the column name is, but you do get the name of the column passed in here. So typically there would be probably a select case here, and for each column name, you would return what its actual type is, whether it's a number or an integer or date or whatever. These particular numbers are from the database data type list that's in the language reference, and 5 is the value that is used for string. I don't remember off the top of my head what the other values are, but they're all listed in the language reference. So that's how this particular thing is implemented to essentially say, okay, the list box is the data source, and we can now send this data source into a report, and the report will know how to fetch it. And if we look at the print code, you can see some common stuff here: printer setup, page setup dialog. And then eventually you get down to the code here to run the report. And that calls the run method, surprisingly, of the report. And we're passing in, and if I put the cursor over that, and you can see at the bottom that it's showing that a run can take a record set, which is pretty common because most people generally will have reports. The data comes from a database, so you can just build up a record set and send the record set into the report. But an alternative implementation of the run event is that it can take anything that implements the interface that we implemented on our Listbox. So we're able to pass that in here along with the printer string. And then we make sure that we actually got a report document that's valid, and then that can be sent to the printer by calling the print method and passing in the graphics object. And oh yeah, this also has the print preview that just displays the report in a canvas with some buttons. We'll look at an example of how to do that in a moment, but that is built into this particular example. And I guess the only other thing I wanted to point out here is just the to use the report, kind of was a little bit buried right here. It works the same as any other object that's would it be in your app. Is you just create a new instance of it using its name. So here it's report as new name report, which is the actual report in the project, and then we just refer to it by its variable and call the methods on it. All right, Terry is asking if there is snap to grid on these. Yeah, I'm dragging it around the C. That's a pretty tight grid. Seems like it is kind of snapping it to it. But that is a very tight grid, so I don't exactly know how useful that will be. It'll depend on your specific report layout. And Kem is noting that there are no constants for these data types, and alas, no, there are not. Certainly if you're using them a lot, it probably would make sense to add some constants for the types you use regularly in your code, so it's a lot more readable than having random numbers embedded in it, which is never a good idea. All right, so that's how you can use something like a list box as a data source. And I have another example we'll go through, but anything can be your data source. I mean, obviously it's pretty easy to start with a database and then use a record set, but I mean, you could easily use an XML file, general text file, anything really, as long as you implement the interface so that it specifies the right way to iterate through the data that you have. All right, let me close this one off. All right, let's take a look at a report that is pulling data from a database. So we can see here, repeating data is displayed. This is all data that's in a particular table in a database, and it's being displayed in the report. So let's see what that sort of thing looks like. Well, first, I guess, show what the report looks like. And you can see here, there's some stuff in the page header. Looks like it needs to be a little bigger because some of the bottom parts of these letters are getting cut off. And then 3 fields. And you see these are still left as untitled, but they point to particular columns in the record set. So this one's pointing to order number, and like I said, I often will type those things in there so that I can easily tell what they're referring to when I'm looking at the layout. And that's pointing to the company column. and the total. So if we go to the code, you can see here that it's connecting to a SQLite database. And then eventually, once all the connections are found, it is doing a select statement to get the particular data that we want to display in the report. It's actually getting a few extra columns in addition to the ones we're actually using in the report. But I believe order number, company, and total are what's displayed in the report. So it puts that together in a string, and then it creates a record set by doing SQL select on the select statement. And then once it has all the pieces it needs, it can then send that off to the report. So the same sort of stuff, does the printer dialogues, gets the graphics object, and then down here, it runs the report, passing in the record set and the printer setup object, and then sends it off to the printer. So you can see if you're able to use a database as a source for your report data, it's a lot simpler. You just query the database, get the data you need, and then send it off to the report, and make sure your columns are entered as the data field names so that everything matches up. Sometimes this is so much simpler that people will often create a simple database or even an in-memory database, load it up with an in-memory SQLite database, and then load it up with the data they want to display in a report, and then use that as the source for the report rather than implementing the interface and writing all the code. So it depends, how you want to work, but certainly it's pretty easy and convenient to go this route. All right, this is another report that uses slightly more advanced report layout. It is using groups. So you can see here in this report layout, there are extra rows here that have group headers for grouping by company name. And only displaying a couple columns here, the order number and the total. This has a more complicated select statement to pull in all the data that is needed. But other than that, the report is handling displaying the data and grouping it up and whatnot. So let's see what that looks like. All right, again, looks like I have to resize a few columns here. But each company name becomes the group header, and then the data that's part of that particular company is displayed underneath it, along with totals by company. So that's giving you grouping capabilities, which can be pretty handy depending on the type of report you're building. Now you're probably noticing the banded report overall design does limit the type of reports you can create. It does, it is used for reports that have repeating data. It's not you can't really use it for free-form reports that have a layout that's got data in certain sections of the report, but the data itself doesn't repeat over and over. And for that sort of thing, you'd have to fall back on doing the printing yourself and positioning things on in the graphics object manually, or again using a different third-party reporting tool that does work in that manner. All right, James is asking if this example will be available afterwards. And yes, actually, I think almost all of these examples are included with Xojo at the moment, although I did do a bit of cleanup and tweaking of them in preparation for this webinar. So all the new ones will be in the next release, 2014 release 1. We'll have the updated ones that I did for this webinar, but you can grab most of the current ones from the current release of Xojo. Yeah, I believe there's in the examples folder, there's a printing and reporting folder. All right, let's see here. This is another report that show how you can do a print preview window. Actually, I'm going to show the first version. So this version here works like the others. You just hit the button and it prints. And if you want to see what it looks like, you got to open it in print preview, which it is very cool on OS 10 that the printing subsystem has built into it this ability to output directly to PDF. It's very handy. People like to have PDF outputs because you can save the document. You can then email it easily. That's great. Unfortunately, the reporting engine built into Xojo doesn't do that. It just generates the graphics. So you don't have any way to create it as PDF necessarily. You can certainly save it as a picture of some sort for emailing, but not as PDF. So OS 10 has the built-in subsystem for that. But there are plenty of drivers available on the Windows side that you can install to essentially give you the same functionality so that when the printer dialog comes up, you can do an export to PDF. And that can be very handy because implementing PDF support on your own is obviously very difficult. It might be one reason why it hasn't shown up in Xojo yet. I believe there are some third-party products that do allow you to generate PDFs, but they probably add some additional cost. So you can see how that just kind of ran a report and threw it up on the printer. But you can also, like we saw when you were printing, display it on the screen first, which is nice. Often, people want to have a way to see and preview things on the screen before they actually commit it to hard copy or even a PDF. This is the same example that's using a canvas control to display the report. And you can see it's got a couple pages, stops when it reaches the ends, but it still has a print button that will allow it to be sent to the printer. And you can see it looks the same. All right, so you can see right here the Run Report button has the usual stuff to connect to the database, query the data, all that stuff. And then it actually didn't even remove the old code. I left it right here, and I just put in the new call to the container control, passing in the report and the record set, and I just returned. So I still got a little bit more cleanup to do on this particular one before I throw it into the examples with Xojo. But the report preview container right here is a container control, which I've done webinars on container controls before in the past, and I'll just reiterate, if you're not using container controls in your apps, you're missing out. These things are a great way to consolidate user interface, build reusable controls that you can use in your apps, and it's a great way to organize things. So I highly recommend them. So in this particular case, you have a container control here that consists of a giant canvas that's going to display the report results, or the report itself, a couple buttons for moving between pages, and then a print button to also essentially rerun the report, but send it to the printer this time. And the initial method on the canvas, on this container, is the show report method, and it takes in the parameter of the report that you want to actually show and its data. And then we still have to call the printer setup to get back some initial settings from the printer so that we know what DPIs to use and whatnot for the drawing. But then you just run the report and you get back a document. And this particular thing saves the document as a property on the canvas, sets the current page to 1, and then tells the the canvas to essentially refresh itself. And then we reset the data set, the record set back to the beginning so that if we want to print it later, it'll actually have all the data. And then the print button gets enabled after it's first shown. And then if we open up the canvas that's on this container, you can see that the paint event's pretty simple. It's just making sure that we actually have a valid report document, and then we draw it to the canvas. So the report document right here has a property called page, and you can supply in the page you actually want to display. And we set the first page to be 1. This is 1 based. And then the buttons just increment that little property that's on there and then tell the canvas to refresh itself so that it will display a new page if that's what you happen to have selected. And then the print button calls print report, of course. And this does the printer setup stuff, but instead of saving the document off for display, it actually is sending it off to the printer so that it gets printed. So you get to use most of the same code for the print preview or the printing to the printer. The one thing I noticed you have to do in this particular case, though, is you do need to create a new instance of the report before it gets sent to the printer. It appears the act of showing it monkeys it up enough that just attempting to reuse it again to send to the printer doesn't quite work right. There may be ways around that. I didn't get enough time to dig in and see if there's something I can do to reset that. But certainly just creating a new instance solved that problem. Yes, and Oblio is also reminding me that this preview example does need a scroll bar. Right now when you run it, it's a bit cut off. You got to resize the window to see more, which is less than ideal. So yeah, before I include this with Xojo, scroll bar that's attached to the canvas so that it can be scrolled is obviously important. But the general technique is very useful, essentially having a reusable container control that you can use for displaying of reports throughout your app. Dennis has asked if the reports can be used in web projects, and I mentioned that earlier at the beginning, but no, these reports do not work in web projects. You cannot use them in web projects. There's no report designer available in web projects. So what do you do when it comes to creating reports in web projects? Well, your options are a bit limited, but I've got one example here I can show you. And essentially, the major option you have available to you for a web project is to use an HTML viewer, create your report as HTML, and manually stuff in the data that you want to display and then load it up. So we can see a quick example of how this might work. So this entire thing here is an HTML layout, but the information can be added in manually. A bit tedious. I suppose you could probably come up with your own set of classes or whatnot to simplify this a bit, but that's really the only option that's available at the moment. There is an ability with the HTML viewer in Web Edition to print it. So you can click it. They call the print method of the HTML viewer, which is what this button does, and it drops down the print dialog so that it'll actually be printable or saved to PDF if you have that sort of thing available to you. And you can see the code on that is not terribly sophisticated. The print button, one line of code that just calls the print method of the HTML viewer. And the HTML viewer is just essentially just loading up the HTML and displaying it, but it is substituting the name of a logo into the HTML so that it displays properly. So obviously this would be quite a bit more work. But if you design your HTML as more of a template type thing with certain things in there, you might be able to get away with some pretty nice stuff with string replacement and whatnot. And I will point out that there's a bunch of questions here I'll get to in a moment. But before I do that, check the time. So obviously you've seen how to print directly, how to use the reporting to create reports, display them on the screen, print them directly as well, and then some what options you have for generating reports using web. Now, in all those cases, not the most sophisticated stuff in the world, unfortunately. So there are several third-party products that you may also want to look at if your reporting needs become more sophisticated. So I will point you to we got a listing of these on our wiki page here in the third-party products section. There's a reporting section that has probably the three products that are well supported and work well with Xojo at the moment. There's Bikini Shorts, Ars Report Designer, and Valentina Reports. And these all can do different things in the built-in Xojo reporting. Some can do more. I believe Valentina is a banded report designer, much like the one in Xojo, but I believe these other two are layout specific. I'm also pretty sure that Bikini Shorts can be used with web apps because it just generates graphics pictures that you can display using the web graphics object on a web canvas. So those are certainly ones to consider if your reporting needs stretch beyond what Xojo provides for you. So let me just come over here and scan question list, get a fair amount here. All right, Fotis is asking if we can have variable height in a header or a header footer. I don't see, do I still have one of these open? So looking at a report, can these particular things here, the header or the footers, be variable height? I don't believe so. I'm trying to think back of ones that I've written. My recollection is that a lot of the variable height stuff isn't 100% reliable, even in the detail band. There is a multi-line property that you can set for some of these things. And obviously the detail band can be varying in height, but I don't think you can tweak the header heights or have it tweak automatically anyway. One thing you can do that I didn't show, see if this, is you can add event handlers to the particular items that are on a report, and then you have two to choose from. There's a after printing event handler and a before printing event handler. And this is just a place where you can write some code that it might allow you to tweak the display or the position of a field before it actually gets sent off to be printed. And you can access it, using the me property to access the various properties of whatever control you happen to be in. And I've used this a little bit on some reports. It might give you the ability to tweak something that otherwise you couldn't tweak in the layout editor. So that might possibly be an option, but I can't say that I've actually tried that. Let's see here. Kem is asking, have the ability to, within the report, we have the ability to handle sorting yourselves, but is there a way to tell the report to sort by the fields? No, the reports don't sort the data. They just work with the data as it's handed to them. So if you want your data to be appearing in some sort of sorted order, you're going to want to pre-sort it before it gets sent off to the report. So if that's coming from a record set, order it appropriately. And if it's your own data set, either loop through it in the order that you want or make sure it's pre-sorted. Richard is asking if you can preload an HTML file as a template and then just search replace field names you've put in. And yeah, I think you could do that for on the website. Technically, you could use HTML on the desktop side as well and display that in HTML viewer if that is something that would work for you. But yeah, that's what I would think is that if you came up with an HTML template design, you could, hard code some specific values in there that are meant to be replaced and then do some sort of swapping out of the values or adding new rows to a HTML table or whatnot. I suppose if you're really clever with CSS, maybe you can you have CSS handle some of that for you. But yeah, I think you could get pretty creative with use of HTML there. But the balance is, how much time do you want to put into all that sort of string manipulation? It may make more sense depending on your report to look at an alternative tool as well. And I didn't show on the third-party page, but there are, I believe, near this, yeah, there's also at least a couple PDF solutions that are listed here that may also be an option in that you could just generate PDF directly and then display that for the user. Wolfgang is asking about paper sizes. And yeah, you'd have to, when you create your report, you have to specify the actual size of the width of the paper anyway. I imagine there's another setting for the actual length. I haven't tried it with A4 or other paper sizes, but I would have to think that that is supported. If there's any European folks that use those paper sizes that know, please, by all means, let us know. Oblio is pointing out that he does use Valentina reports and it works really well, so that's good. I haven't personally, I've used out of this list on some projects, I have used the RS Report Designer. I haven't yet had a chance to use Bikini Shorts, which I believe was announced at the Xojo Developer Conference last year. And Valentina reports looks like it could be pretty neat, but I haven't had a chance to play with that one. See, Mark is asking if you can specify the printer that the report is sent to. Well, I don't know of a direct way to do that. One way that I've done that in the past is by saving the printer setup strings, but that does require the user to actually still pick the printer at some point so that its information gets set in the printer setup string, and then you can reuse it. I'm not aware of a way where you can specifically say programmatically, go to this printer. That maybe can be done using OS API calls, but I don't know that that's a way that you can do that directly in Xojo. It doesn't seem like we have that capability on any of the printing or reporting classes. Adrian is asking if there's a body before and after event. I'm checking. I did not know. It doesn't look like it. It looks like it's only on the controls. Nope, it appears to be control specific. Yep. Richard is asking on a web app if you can force the download of an HTML file rather than displaying it or whatnot. And yeah, absolutely. That would be the same as you would any other file that you want to download. You would just create your HTML directly. You create it, as a string in memory. You save it off to somewhere on the disk, and then you can create a web file that points to it and set its force download property to it, and then get its URL, show it, and then the user will get either be prompted to download or it will download automatically. But same as any other file you would download using a web app. Michael is asking if Valentina reporting works with non-Valentina databases. That's a good question. I haven't used it, so I'm not 100% sure. I believe it works with non-Valentina databases. Maybe someone else here will be able to answer that. And quickly, yes, we get an answer from Fabian that says, yes, it does. So that's good. If you're already using a particular database like SQLite or something, you may not want to have to migrate to a different database. All right, well, that covers all my examples. Looks like I made it through all the questions here. So it looks like that is about the end of today. I want to remind people, go to the forums. A lot of great questions here. Certainly, if you run into other things, ask on the forums. You may have people that have tried something already that you're trying to do that will be able to offer some advice. Or someone may point you to one of the third-party tools and say, hey, if you're trying to do that, go this route. Might save yourself some time. So definitely take advantage of the forums. And for those of you that are coming to the Xojo Developer Conference in March, I look forward to seeing and talking with you. That is just a little over a month away and sold out this year, which is very exciting for us. And as always, this webinar has been recorded and will be available probably later this week on the wiki page here in the webinar training and tutorial videos section. The webinars pop up here, and I am noting that I haven't added the link to last week's SQLite one, which is uploaded to YouTube, so I will do that shortly this afternoon. All right, thank you everyone for attending. We'll hopefully see most of you again next week. Have a great rest of your day.